Hello, how's everyone doing today? I'm here with clinical psychologist and author, Dr. Michael Edelstein, and he is an anarchist as well. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Daniel. Thanks for inviting me.
Anytime. I guess my first question is, what brought you to anarchy?
Well, in a word, Walter Block. Uh, Walter was introduced to me when we were both living in Brooklyn in the 70s because we both were chess players. So Walter and I would get together periodically and play chess. And in between games, we discussed politics. I was a liberal Democrat then.
Hmm.
And ultimately, he won the political debates, turned me into an anarchist, and I won a majority of the chess games.
Right. Yes. I'm sure he would accuse you of cheating, right? Like he does Tom Woods.
Could be.
Yeah. So as a clinical psychologist, do you find your anarchism more confirmed? Because obviously there's a lot of political intervention in medicine and with doctor licensing and stuff like that.
Well, I don't know if my anarchism is confirmed, but my idea that the government tends to make things worse has been confirmed because I see all kinds of interventions in clinical psychology that tend to make things worse. For example, professional licensing, I was required to be licensed by the state in order to practice psychology. And in order to be licensed by the state, it meant taking various exams and studying for the exams, getting a PhD in psychology. All these things are long processes, very, very expensive, and uh, and doesn't necessarily turn you into a competent clinical psychologist. I've met licensed clinical psychologists who didn't know what they were doing, some who were making their clients worse, but since they had the air of licensure, they were respected and people went to them. Whereas if there were no government licensure, of course, there would be private certifying agencies, as there are now,
Right.
and word of mouth reputation, which would be much more effective and helpful to prospective clients in finding someone who's competent than looking for a license and looking for a PhD degree and those kinds of things.
Hmm. No, I agree. And I also think it creates a moral hazard problem where people are less skeptical. They say, oh, this guy is approved by the state. He must know what he's talking about. And I think if you didn't have that, people would be a little more leery and you'd really have to prove yourself.
Absolutely, I definitely agree with that.
Yeah. Right. And I think there's this misapprehension that if that any person will just open up a shop and say they're a doctor. I mean, people are not going to go to you if they don't trust you. I mean, government can have a license requiring everyone to buy Cadillacs or Volvos because they think it's the safest car, but all you do is make it where now anything that's cheaper than a Volvo, people who are poor can't afford. And I would say even subpar healthcare is probably better than none at all. So even if
Uh,
you're going to go to a so-called quack, which is just another word for a doctor who doesn't get government permission, uh, that's not necessarily going to be worse than no one.
that's right. By the way, another problem with the government intervening that may not be as evident as professional licensing is that there are certain mandates about what you have to report about your client if they say certain things. So, for example, if they say they're feeling suicidal, you're required to do a suicide assessment survey to see how serious it is. And if, based on the results, it seems serious, you have to report this to the authorities. So what happens is people are not stupid. Many of them are aware of this, so they're very reluctant to say they're feeling suicidal because they don't want intervening third parties coming in and hospitalizing them or doing other things. So I've had clients who say, you know, I've had suicidal thoughts, but don't worry, I'm not suicidal. I'm not suicidal. Protecting themselves. So it tends to put a damper on what people will really say and talk about themselves in a therapy session.
Right. But doesn't that violate doctor patient confidentiality. Like if someone said I plan on killing someone, that I think it's rational that you would have to report that. But if someone says I'm feeling suicidal, that's not really a threat to anyone else. I don't know why you'd have to report that.
I certainly do believe it's a violation of client uh, therapist privilege
Yeah.
and a violation of confidentiality. But even if someone said, I'm going to kill someone, I think that having to report that would be a violation. I think it would be up to the therapist and up to the therapist to decide what's the best course to take. If someone tells me that they're threatening to kill someone, I'm not going to go report them immediately. I'm going to work with them and find out what's behind this and what their thinking is, and show them how their thinking will get them into trouble in the long run and help them change their suicidal or homicidal thinking. So just a law saying you have to go report immediately doesn't make sense.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, I don't think you have a positive obligation to report someone telling you something. I don't even think you have a positive obligation to report a crime you witnessed or anything like that.
Right.
Right. I mean, if I see someone, harming someone else, I don't think I have to call the police. Uh, should I? I think is a different issue, but I don't think there should be
Right.
a requirement. Yeah, I would agree with that. Um, I mean, one of the things that sort of you know, it seems like the medical profession is a lot. It seems to not really. I think the FDA and big pharma. I think in many ways, I think has hampered uh, development by not allowing certain illegal substances or certain drugs that may be beneficial uh, in treating things. I know I've heard that some people say that if you take 2 or 3 sessions of MTMA with a clinical therapist, that's very effective at treating PTSD. I can tell you from personal experience, I've been prescribed like pretty much every drug in the world as a kid, and I had anxiety, depression, whatever, and they never worked. And I hated taking anti-anxiety medication. In fact, it would make me more anxious because I would take it and I wouldn't feel anything, and I would be frustrated. I'd be like, "Why doesn't this work?" So that would make me more anxious. And when I took psilocybin mushrooms, and I found I was more confident, my anxiety decreased, and when I took it, I found it actually very therapeutic. And so, I sort of consider myself somewhat of a drug pusher, but I guess what are your thoughts on that and the war on drugs and alternative illegal substances that may have therapeutic value?
Yeah, well, it's kind of arbitrary because doctors can prescribe certain drugs, but not other drugs. So why are antidepressants any better or worse than MDMA or other kinds of what are now illegal drugs? So I don't think it makes much sense. Also, psychologists in general are not permitted to prescribe medication. Uh, Normally, it requires a medical degree, not a PhD.
Right.
So it's another thing that limits psychologists helping people. But even beyond that, I don't think it makes sense to require anybody to uh, prohibit someone from taking a drug or someone from prescribing a drug. If you want to take a drug, why would you need a doctor's prescription? It's your body. It's up to you what you're going to put in your body. So there are a lot of problems with that.
Hmm. No, I would agree. I would say you probably shouldn't have to get a prescription. Uh, right. I mean, as somewhat of I'm not really a pragmatist, but I guess if you would argue from a pragmatic perspective, I guess maybe requiring uh, a doctor's slip as a step to end the war on drugs might be a good medium first, because you have to learn to crawl before you can learn to walk. Um, but no, I mean I agree, and I also think one of the evils of the war on drugs is that it also reduces the incentive to test drugs. So there are new drugs being discovered all the time, and a lot of people have a fear that because these drugs are illegal, they're not even going to do studies to actually see are they harmful or are they not, and
Yeah,
how harmful and what the risks are and the benefits.
exactly.
Yeah, because I've sort of viewed drugs sort of like sex. and which is, in school we're told just say no to both. And to me, that's very irrational. As sort of as someone who's studying economics, I believe sort of in doing cost benefit analysis. I don't believe in all or nothing. I believe in degrees, and I believe in spectrums, and I believe in probabilities. I mean, there is a risk getting behind the wheel of a car that I'll get in a car accident. There's a risk being a passenger, I'll get killed. There's a risk walking down the street, I'll get hit by a car. There's a risk that even if I stay home because the outside world is too scary, someone will rob me and kill me, or that there'll be a fire. So everything in life has with it risk, and I think it's very irrational. And I think you certainly see this when it comes to terrorism as well. This fear that anything that has the slightest probability of risk, you shouldn't engage in it at all.
Well said. I totally agree.
Yeah. So I think that's just very irrational. So, I mean, so what are your thoughts in terms of maybe moving forward in terms of trying to combat that sort of bad thinking, right? Like drugs are bad, or because first of all, when I hear drugs are bad, I don't even know what that means, right? Like, people take Ambien if they're too tired. If they want to fall asleep, they take caffeine. They have sugar. I mean, I don't know a person in the world besides maybe a baby or a toddler who hasn't taken a drug in their life. And yes, not all. I'm not advocating all drugs. I don't think injecting yourself with heroin is probably a good idea. I mean, I don't know. I've never done heroin, but from what I've heard, it's probably not the smartest thing. But I certainly don't believe that because a drug is illegal, that makes it necessarily more harmful than a drug that's legal. I mean, that's nonsense. I think we both know that nicotine is far more harmful than cannabis, or that alcohol is considered one of the worst, if not the worst drug.
Yeah, well, you said a lot of things there, Daniel. You said you wouldn't necessarily advocate all drugs. I wouldn't advocate any drugs. I'd advocate individual choice. Make up your mind what you want to do vis-a-vis drugs. Take them, don't take them, experiment with them, find out what works for you, do research, whatever you want to do. So I think it's largely an individual thing in terms of drugs and what helps people and what doesn't. Also, you asked me what I would suggest to combat this overgeneralized thinking about drugs, and also in general to combat the state. And I think the answer is the same, and that is education. The more we get the word out about how this is harmful, how it's immoral, how it's unpragmatic in all different ways, by running for office as Ron Paul did, or doing podcasts as you do, or writing books, or speaking, or joining think tanks, the more we get the word out and educate people, I think the better chance we have of changing mindset. And I think that if you look at how slavery was abolished in the world, largely it was abolished through education. The U.S. was a notable exception, although education helped, but in the U.S. it was a war. But in most of the world, slavery was abolished, not through wars, but just through people getting more of a moral sense about what it means to be human.
Right. So let me just talk from personal experience. I mean, so someone said to me recently, "What do you think is the best way to end the war on drugs?" And I said, "Give them drugs. Your view will change once you put these things in your body." I mean, before I ever took recreational drugs, I was pretty anti-drug. I mean, I always was consider myself a libertarian since high school at least. So I never supported the war on drugs. But even when I was against the war on drugs, I still thought drugs were bad and drugs were harmful, and I sort of believed in the lies of propaganda. And it wasn't.
Daniel, may I interrupt?
Yeah.
You believe drugs were bad and harmful for everyone, or for you, or what?
Well, I guess I just sort of believe the propaganda that we're told when we go to school. If you take pot, it'll make you retarded or something. I mean, I happen not to like weed myself, but if you take pot, it'll make you retarded, or the lies that the type of reefer madness stuff, or the dare programs that we're subjected to as a kid. I guess I sort of believed that as a young age, and it wasn't really until it wasn't really until my first experience taking an illegal drug was finding out that my father smokes weed and I couldn't be geekier than him. So that was sort of my first. That was sort of, and he's a smart guy. So I figured my father's an intelligent guy. If he's taken cannabis, it can't be that harmful. And then after that, I spoke to. I was at some. I was around a lot of anarchists, and so I asked this one person how she became an anarchist, and she said shrooms, lots and lots of shrooms. I'm like, what does that mean? And she's like, take them and you'll find out. So I'm like, okay. And I made myself the human guinea pig. And I think that once I took it and I realized that it has beneficial properties, and I researched stuff myself because I don't want to put anything in my body before doing a lot of research. I consider myself a responsible drug user. Um, and I also recommend a drug testing kit as well. So you know what you're getting. But I think it wasn't until I tested these drugs myself I realized all the stuff that they say about them are bullshit. So if you can't convince people with reason, right? I think, like, I remember talking to someone who said that they used to be afraid of flying, and they went and jumped off a plane. They had a parachute, of course, but that's how they got rid of their fear of flying. That they jumped off an airplane and they realized it's not as bad as I think. So I think if you can't persuade people with reason, just put some acid in their water, and they'll figure out. Okay, maybe that's a bit immoral, but they'll figure out it's not as bad as they think.
Right. I agree.
Okay, the doctor said, you heard it, folks. The doctor recommends putting acid in people's drinks.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not too optimistic, unfortunately. It seems like we're going very, very slow because this stuff is so obvious, right? I mean, we have this thing called the internet. You don't actually have to believe what people on the news tell you. You can research yourself for what the effects of certain things are. And the fact is that most people don't seem to do it. They seem to just take people's word, and instead of researching for themselves the truth.
Yeah, I think the larger problem than believing what the newspapers tell you is the government schools and the propaganda that starts when you're very, very young.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think people hate more than anything in the world is thinking, in my experience. And if you express the fact and encourage thinking, you're yelled at and criticized and called an extremist and stuff like that.
And you're taught in the government schools the right line, and there's no reason to think.
Right. Yeah. Right. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems like we're going very slowly. I mean, people are, legalizing pot, and obviously they're saying that's not the end of the world. And so I say, okay, all drugs are next, but we'll see. I don't know. I also think out of all the things government does, I think the war on drugs is probably the most evil.
More evil than bombing innocent people in the Middle East?
Well, no, in one sense, because, well, it depends. In the sense that a government pretends to protect their citizens, they don't pretend to protect foreign people. So if you're going to make the claim that the government pretends to have an allegiance to people who live here, then I think you can make somewhat of an argument that government harming the people in their own country is maybe a worse crime than foreigners. Now, I don't believe that myself, because I believe every human life has equal value. Well, not all human life has equal value. Let's be honest. If you're an asshole, I think your life has less value than if you're a person who contributes to the floundering of the human race. But obviously, death is a tragedy. So maybe not that. But outside of war, I would say a war that results in, massive bloodshed and bombing, I would say the war on drugs is probably next. Certainly from it's the worst domestic policy. How's that?
That could be. I'm not an economist, so there are other domestic policies that are very harmful, such as the Federal Reserve and other kinds of things. So I never thought in terms of which is worst domestically.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, they're all bad. I think government does. I mean, the only thing government's good at is killing a lot of people in a short amount of time.
Well, I think they're also good at propaganda. Look at,
yes,
they've convinced most of the people in the U.S. that the government is here to help you, that you can't live your own life unless the government told you what to do. So they're quite good at doing that.
Right. And people often subscribe uh, good motives to themselves and bad motives to others, right? Like
Yeah,
if people say, well, without government, the poor will just starve to death because
right,
there won't be enough resources to help the poor. You say to these people, well, would you help the poor? And they're
right,
like, well, I would. Okay, so you would, but you think everyone else is not as good as you,
right,
essentially.
right. Yeah. Or do you really need a boss to tell you how to live your life? Well, I don't need a boss, but everyone else does.
Right. Yes. Yes. I'm great. Everyone else is an idiot.
Yes.
Seems to be the mentality. All right. So in terms of, depression and anxiety, how do you recommend overcoming that? Or
Oh, well, that's a
that's your
good thing
specialty.
too. It's a, what's that?
Because that's your specialty. So let's
Yeah.
go in there.
Yeah, it's a deep question. And the first part of this is, where do emotions come from in the first place? Because depression and anxiety are emotions, albeit disturbed emotions. So the question is, where do these emotions come from? And the answer is something that most people don't see intuitively, and that is, our emotions never come from situations themselves. If I win the lottery and I'm happy, most people would say I'm happy because I won the lottery. But that's not the way we work psychologically. The way we work psychologically is, it's never situations or events or adversity in our lives themselves that cause our emotions, but rather it's our thinking about the situations, are the thoughts, ideas, notions, attitudes, beliefs, values, views that we have in our heads that cause our emotions, not the situations itself. So if I win the lottery, the reason I'm happy is because I'm telling myself, isn't it wonderful I won the lottery? I'm going to do all these great things. Life will be easy, etc. So that's what causes our emotions. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes. No, I would agree. It's not I mean, you could have two people who have a very similar experience and interpret things differently.
Exactly. And
Right.
I maintain that the myth that situations cause our emotions is a greater myth than the government is my friend and the government is here to help me. Just about all people throughout history, throughout cultures, believe it's situations, not their ideas in their head, that causes their emotions.
Right. But do you think like because for me, because I think like in terms of my own life, like I'm confident when it comes to my brains and when it comes to my sense of humor because people tell me I'm smart and people tell me that I'm funny, but I'm not particularly confident when it comes to looks because that's not something that people have pretty much complimented me on, and it seems that I'm great at attracting, the women that I'm interested in attracting. So I would say that my confidence in one area or my insecurities in another area, at least from my own point of view, stem from experience. Right, like
Yeah.
if I do stand up comedy and people are laughing, I'm going to feel very confident and and show that on stage. But if I start doing a bit and for the first 4 or 5 minutes people are not laughing, I think I'm going to feel more confident, not confident, and at least in my own mind, that's because I'm seeing people aren't laughing, and that's sort of reinforcing my lack of confidence.
See, you just proved that that's a great myth because you just bought into it. That it's a situation, people laughing or not laughing, that leads to your feelings of confidence, but that's not the case. It's what you tell yourself, the ideas in your head. Now, you could make the case that if people are laughing, it's more likely you're going to say, I'm a great comedian, I'm wonderful, people love me, isn't that terrific? It's more likely, but it still comes from your thinking, not from the situations. And some people, believe it or not, might be great comedians, and there are some, and yet they feel very, very insecure about their abilities, and they still get nervous before they go on stage. By the way, one of my books is called Stage Fright: How 40 Stars Beat America's #1 Fear, which is stage fright. And my co-author and I interviewed stars about their stage fright, and one of them was Robin Williams. And we asked Robin Williams, do you still get anxious when you're performing? And he said, oh, totally. So just because you're a great success doesn't mean you're going to tell yourself, well, I'm okay. There's no reason to feel anxious or anything like that. So it gets back to your thinking. Does that make sense?
But what influences your thinking, right? Because does your thinking just come arbitrarily and you have a thought that just comes based on your genetic makeup, or is your thinking based on your experience and that experience leads to how you think in the future, right? Like sometimes people say to me, you should be more confident. And I'm like, well, why? I should just wake up and just think that? I don't think it works that way. I mean, you either have a thought or you don't. I don't think someone can just become happy based on positive thinking or become miserable based on negative thinking. I don't even know if your thoughts are something you can control.
Well, your thoughts are something you control, and I'll get into that in more detail. But just to answer this question, Daniel, what influences your thinking? You used a great word, influence. There are many influences on your thinking. One is whether the people are laughing when you do stand-up, but there are many other influences, your genetic predispositions and other kinds of things. It could be how you feel at the moment, whether you're fighting the flu or whether you're fighting fatigue. So there are various influences. So I'm not maintaining there aren't influences on our thinking. I'm maintaining that the bottom line, the fundamental cause of our emotions is our thinking. And no matter what your influences are, your thinking, your beliefs, your attitudes is what causes your emotions. Let me give you an example, a clinical example of that. I've had insecure clients, and when I ask them, why do you think you're so insecure? Some of them would say, well, when I was growing up, my parents were always critical of me, so that's why I'm so insecure now. But I've had other clients, when I ask, why do you suppose you're insecure? They've said, well, when I was growing up, I had very loving, supportive parents, and I got addicted to that. And now I don't know whether people are going to love me and support me the way my parents did. And actually, some of them criticize me, which my parents never did. And that's why I'm insecure. So it just shows that the same situations can be interpreted differently by different people. And the reason is not only do we have various influences and different influences, but we can think about our thinking. And so we can judge whether our thinking makes sense and change our thinking. Did you want to say something?
Well, I guess, yeah. So let's say, you have two people. One, as a kid, was very, very popular, well-liked. People would, women would walk up to them and show that they're interested. And the other kid was bullied and made fun of. I mean, you don't think that based on that, there's no way to tell who's going to be more confident as an adult, right? Because I would say that, and maybe I still buy into the myth, I would say that if someone's bullied, they could say, well, I was bullied in the past. Why am I not going to be bullied in the future? People have shown in the past that there's something about me that they don't like. So why would they like me later? Whereas a person who's confident can say, look, people liked me in the past. Why should it be different in the future? I've got, people have shown me that they've liked me. Why should that suddenly stop? So I mean, I don't know. I guess I don't see why. Maybe I'm just trying to be rational about this, but I just don't see why that if how someone's treated would not have an influence on how they see themselves.
Well, I said the word influence is a very good and important word. We all have influences on how we think, right? If you want to speak Spanish, if you study Spanish every day for the next year, you'll be able to speak Spanish. So the influence on your thinking was studying and practicing. That was an influence. But the bottom line was you speak Spanish because of your own thinking, no matter what the influences are. So I'm not arguing against influences at all. That's a very important part. By the way, one of the most important part of influences is the unseen. We have the seen and the unseen here in psychology. The seen is how your parents treated you, how your friends treated you, whether you're handsome or ugly or things like that. That's a seen. But the unseen is your genetic predispositions. And your genetic predispositions are a large determinant in how you think and what emotions you create. By the way, you brought up the bullying situation. Often people are bullied as kids because they're insecure in the first place. So it's not that they become adults, insecure adults, because they were bullied, but rather they're bullied because they're insecure, and then the insecurity carries on up to their adulthood.
Right. Yeah. I mean, maybe, I remember I tell a lot of self-deprecating jokes, and I I do stand-up comedy on occasion. One of the jokes that I say is, a lot of women don't like that I say self-deprecating jokes, and they'll say to me, what you should be more confident, Daniel. You're a great guy. You're funny. You're smart. You're charming. You should be more confident. A woman would be lucky to have you. Of course, I wouldn't go out with you. And the joke, of course, being, when why the hell would I be confident? So I mean, so I think, at least in my own life, and maybe it's just my point of view. I mean, you're the psychologist, you know more about this than me. Obviously, I'm not going to be so presumptuous, but I mean, I think how I view myself is, in part, has to do with a lot, I think, of how other people have viewed me, and what my experiences are. And it's true, people can interpret things in different ways, but I'm sure that if I was a ladies' man, I would feel way more confident than I am now, let's say.
Yeah, well, I think we agree. We agree that there are influences on our thinking, but I think, I'm not sure you agree, that ultimately the bottom line is, even with these influences, what creates our emotions is what we tell ourselves.
Okay. And what leads to what we tell ourselves?
Well, what we decide, how we juggle all these influences, our genetic predispositions, what people tell us, how successful we are, unsuccessful, other kinds of things. There's very good research on adult personality, and an excellent author, Judith Rich Harris, sums it up in her book, The Nurture Assumption. And what she's come up with is that about 50% of adult personality is governed by our genetic predispositions. 40% is governed by out of the home environment, your peers, the people you look up to, your culture, things like that. And only 10% is governed by in-home environment. So it's a mix. All these go together in various proportions, and that leads to how we think and how we look at things. And then also practice. For example, for most of my young life, I was very depressed. And then when I was 19, I started therapy with a brilliant therapist named Albert Ellis, and I'm a follower of his school of therapy called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, or REBT. And he helped me turn from a depressed person into an upbeat, positive person, because he taught me ways to change my depressed thinking, how to question it, challenge it, contradict it, and think much more realistically and reasonably about myself, my life, and others.
Okay, so knowing that your disposition is not based on experience, why is that important in terms of combating depression?
Well, experience is an influence. I'm not clear what your question is. Could you try that again?
My question is, why does it matter what causes you to be depressed in terms of combating it? Right? The insight.
I see. That's a good question.
Yeah.
And the answer is, it mainly matters in terms of what your thinking is, because our emotions come from our thinking. And if we're depressed, it comes from depressed kind of thinking. So it matters what our depressed thinking is, in order to hold it up to the light of day and see if there's evidence for it, and reject it if there's no evidence for it. But the other influences don't matter very much, just our thinking, since that's the bottom line. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I would like to not be depressed even if I see evidence for it. I would like to reject it no matter what. But yeah. So it's mainly you know. So what you would say to, like, a Robin Williams? Well, a lot of people like you. You look how life look. You have a lot of talent. What you should not be depressed or something like that. Or
Oh, no, not at all.
I guess
What I would say is, what are you telling yourself that leads you to be depressed. And the thinking that leads to emotional problems can be summarized in terms of three basic areas of irrational thinking. If we think irrationally, we'll get ourselves into trouble. And if we have disturbed emotions, we're thinking irrationally. So if you want to know what you're thinking, look at one of these three main areas. And the first area is a demand on oneself, and that takes the form of, because I prefer to do well in life and be approved of, therefore I absolutely must be. And if I'm not, I'm no good, I'm a worthless failure, I'm a pathetic loser, and that creates anxiety, depression, and guilt. The second area of thinking, or the second irrational core belief, is a demand on others. And that takes the form of, you must treat me well, fairly, and kindly. And if you don't, you're no good, you're a rotten person, you deserve to roast in hell, and I've just appointed myself your roaster. And that leads to resentment, hostility, and anger. And then the third core irrational demand is not a demand on people, not a demand on oneself or others, but rather it's a demand on the conditions of one's life, an impersonal demand. And that takes the form of, because I prefer life to be fair, easy, and hassle-free, therefore it absolutely must be, and I can't stand it when it's not, and I'm going to be miserable forever and do what I can to escape these horrors in my life. And that leads to procrastination and addictions. So if you're addicted, you're angry, you're anxious or depressed, look for the must, look for the should. It's not your preferences that are causing that, but escalating them into absolutistic demands, must, should, supposed tos, have tos, and then uproot those demands. Question, challenge, and contradict those demands. And when you do, then your emotions will change, because your emotions are created by your thinking. When I give talks to libertarian audiences, sometimes I introduce this topic by saying that in libertarianism, there's one overriding principle, and that is the non-aggression principle. And in psychotherapy, there's one overriding principle, and that is give up all musts, give up all absolutistic demands. So the non-aggression principle leads to political freedom, and divesting yourself of musts and shoulds leads to psychological freedom.
Cool. What do you think of Thomas Zaz? And
before we go on to Thomas Zaz, Daniel, did you have any questions about what I said? It was a big, mini speech, and I said a lot. Did it all make sense?
Yes.
So you would agree that when you're depressed, when you're anxious, when you're procrastinating, it's because of your demands in your head, the musts and shoulds, either demand on yourself, others, or situations.
I mean, yes, I certainly wish my brain had an on and off switch. That's for sure.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
Or a snooze button.
It has a long-term on and off switch, just like if you wanted to speak Italian fluently, you can't put the on switch and now you speak Italian fluently, but you can do it slowly by practicing Italian.
Right.
And then at the end of 6 months or a year, the switch will be on. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Same thing with, what's that?
Right. But I mean, sometimes what I mean is, I think a lot, not necessarily profound stuff, but I'm in my own head a lot. That's one of the reasons I like recreational drugs, because they help combating that. And I think it's very therapeutic, and I recommend it. But I don't know. I think there is a part of me that sometimes I wish I wasn't around myself all the time. You know what I mean? Not that I
elaborate on that.
Well, just because I'm in my own head, and sometimes I just wish, leave me alone, Daniel. I don't want to be with you now. And I don't mean in sort of a self-loathing kind of way. I just mean in a way of sort of I guess you want your head to have the snooze button, and you just sometimes you don't want your thoughts to be there all the time.
Right. Yeah, so that's frustrating, but
Yeah.
life consists of frustrations.
Yeah. No, I agree.
But getting back to my question, so would you agree that if you're depressed, you're anxious, you're procrastinating, it's not caused by, primarily caused by anything, but you're thinking in terms of demands, musts, and shoulds? That
Uh,
makes
yeah, I guess I would agree.
So therefore, now you know how you could get over any psychological problem that might come down the pike, and that is question, challenge, and contradict your musts and shoulds. Show yourself, just like there's no evidence that the government is your friend, there's no evidence that anything has to be the way you want it to be. There's only one way things would have to be the way you want it to be, and that is if you were elected ruler of the universe, and then you would control everything, then everything would have to be the way you would like it to be. But unfortunately, reality is reality, not what you think it should be. So the solution is acceptance. Accept yourself unconditionally with your imperfections, accept others unconditionally with theirs, and accept life and your situations unconditionally with its problems, and then you'll be in much better shape to do better, get people to like you more, and succeed more in life.
All right, that sounds like good advice. I'm probably not going to follow it just because that's not who I am. I can't love anyone unconditionally. But
I didn't say, wait a second. Did I say anything about loving anyone unconditionally?
or no. I guess accepting things unconditionally or whatever.
Yeah, accepting hassles unconditionally because that's reality. You're a logical thinker, Daniel. I admire that about you.
Thank you.
And when you talk about politics, you're very good at sticking to reality. So why wouldn't you want to stick to reality in these psychological realms that would benefit you in the long run?
No, I do, I guess. Well, I guess it depends what you mean by accept things unconditionally. I mean, I accept that I can't control other people, and I accept the fact that reality isn't the way you want to be, and that, right, it's sort of like the line from Faulty Towers, where John Cleese, the manager of the hotel, says, I could run the hotel perfectly if it weren't for these guests. Right. So, no, I guess I could say, the universe would be great if there was no one else on it, but so I accept the fact that human beings are flawed and
And
stuff like that.
you're
So
flawed, and you accept the fact that life consists of one hassle after another, and rather than avoiding them, it's better to face them if you want to achieve your goals.
yes, I would agree.
Yeah.
I would agree.
Okay, good. So you're the first totally rational person I've met in a long time.
Thank you very much. No, I'm not a fan of being a turtle and sticking your head in your inner shell when the world is scary. I'm not a fan of doing that. I think reality is.
Good.
Um,
You
uh,
asked me about Thomas Saz.
yes, and yes, Thomas Saz, the myth of mental illness. What are your thoughts on that stuff?
Well, actually, Thomas Saz had a public debate with my mentor, Albert Ellis, who I mentioned earlier. And he was Thomas Saz was maintaining there's no such thing as mental illness. Now, a lot of this depends on how you define things, but certainly people have psychological pathologies in their thinking, as we've just discussed. And if you don't want to call that mental illness, that's okay. And if you want to call it mental illness, that's okay, as long as you define what you mean. Now, there has been evidence of genetic predispositions and genetic links to certain psychological problems like shyness, schizophrenia, alcohol addiction, things like that. So I think Thomas Saz would deny that. His idea was the reason people have emotional problems is simply because they don't play by the rules of the game. And he discussed, did you read The Myth of Mental Illness?
I read parts, not the whole
Yeah,
thing.
so he discusses this in a couple of chapters in that book, where he says, well, so to help schizophrenics, just teach them the rules of the game. Now, I've worked with schizophrenics, and that is not their problem. Their thinking is very, very crooked, and they have many, many very strong musts and shoulds. And when I help them with that, they do somewhat better.
Right.
Of course, I agree with Thomas Saz's political ideas.
Right.
Although I think at one point he might have changed his view, but at one point he wanted to ban pornography.
Really, he struck me as quite the libertarian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, I think he overemphasized the power of psychiatrists. He wrote a book called The Therapeutic State, where he claimed that anything the government doesn't like, they therapize and they say you're crazy and things like that. So maybe in the former Soviet Union, but it's not quite as bad in the US, although it's somewhat bad, where two psychiatrists could get you committed to a mental hospital for 72 hours. So
Right.
it's somewhat bad, but they're not, they can't throw away the key. And also, most psychiatrists don't do that. It doesn't happen that frequently.
I mean, you do have it, right? Wasn't, let's say, for example, homosexuality was considered a mental illness, right? And was on the DSM,
Yeah, but
right?
no one was thrown in jail for it.
True, but it was still labeled a mental illness, right?
Oh,
So,
yes. Oh, yes. There are all these things that are labeled.
right.
Uh,
I mean, I think mainly
actually,
people,
actually, it wasn't labeled a mental illness. It was labeled some type of personality disorder. The Bible of all this is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and they just categorize various disorders. They don't call anything a mental illness.
right. I mean, I think when people, and you saw it in the recent shooting in Orlando, this guy has a mental illness, and and I think people use the phrase and throw it. To me, the phrase mental illness is sort of like irrational. It's just an attempt to explain away behavior you don't understand. You're acting in a way I wouldn't act, so I'm just gonna write it off as either irrational or a mental illness. I mean, are you a therapist? Did you diagnose the person? How do you know this person has a mental illness? You can be perfectly sane and murder a bunch of people. I'm not saying you're a moral person if you do that, but that blowing someone up, I don't think is sufficient to determine that you have a mental illness.
That's right. I would agree, but usually it is not always. And in the case of Omar Mateen, it was clear. Now, he wasn't a client of mine, so I didn't diagnose him personally, but it was fairly clear by some of the facts of his life and that he's pretty crazy.
Right, but no, but they do this every time there's a shooting. Every time there's a shooting, they label the shooter mentally ill.
Yeah. Well, probably it could be that every time in the United States in the last 50 years, when someone committed mass murder, the guy was crazy. I would bet that would be the case.
Right. I mean, to me, I define mental illness as someone who who ignores the facts of reality. Like if you hear a voice that isn't there, I think that's a sign of mental illness. Right. I would define mental illness, and maybe my definition's wrong, is just thinking reality is having a view of reality which isn't true. Right. Seeing something that isn't there, hearing something that isn't there. Um, you know, so if you hear a voice in your head that's not really there, or if you think people are talking to you and they're not, I would say that if you think you're another person, right? So I think that I guess would be my definition of mental illness. Just
Well, wouldn't it depend, Daniel, on how long it goes on and what causes it?
Sure, but that's just, I guess that's an initial first step. I mean, again, I'm not a doctor. This is not my field. I'm just saying my intuitive view is that mental illness is right. Like if someone has color illness, I would say like colorblind. That person you might say has a color illness because they're not seeing the colors as they exist in reality. Let's say. Not that there's anything wrong with people who are colorblind, of course, but just that you could say that's an illness in the sense that someone had that their eyesight is distorting the true sense of color.
Right. Yeah, that's called colorblind.
Right. Yes. So you could say that's an illness. Let's say.
You could.
Right.
It depends on how you define illness.
Right. Well, how would you define it?
I don't like to use the term illness in psychological context. I would say someone's emotionally disturbed or someone's very, very emotionally disturbed. I don't even like these labels such as schizophrenic or borderline personality disorder or anything like that. It doesn't really get to the heart of the problem or what to do about it. I would diagnose people in terms of their irrational beliefs. Someone who's very insecure and feels very inadequate, I would diagnose as having a strong demand for approval or a strong demand to do well. That's a more useful diagnosis, because if someone has a strong demand for approval, they think they absolutely must have approval or else they're no good, then that gives you an idea of what you can do about it. question, challenge, and contradict that idea that you have to do well and get approval, otherwise you're no good. And if you do that, normally you'll find there's no evidence that you absolutely have to. There's evidence you strongly prefer to do well and get approval because you get advantages if you do and disadvantages if you don't. But there's no evidence for the must.
I don't even think there's anything wrong with that. That's just their value system, right? A person
wrong with what?
I mean, there are certain people in the world who, and I know people like this. I'm not going to name them, but I know certain people who, and I'm not like this. In fact, I'm probably more the opposite. But there are certain people in the world who must be liked by everyone they meet. They can't stand.
They must be liked?
Huh?
You think they think they must be liked?
I mean, there are certain people who feel that everyone they meet must like them, and when someone doesn't like them, they really have to know the reason why, and they're very upset about it.
Yeah.
Right.
So
that's not me.
Right. They have a psychological problem.
But I don't know. I think that's just their value system. I don't know if that's a problem. I mean, why is that a problem? Why is there anything wrong with someone who's like that? Right? I mean, for me, I'm sort of the opposite. When people hate me, I sort of like it for some perverse reason. But so I like. Yes.
You asked me why is it a problem?
Yes.
It's a problem because when they think that way and they get very upset, it tends to sabotage their goals. So when I talk about an emotional problem, I just am referring to a problem in terms of a person achieving their goals. And when someone's anxious, depressed, angry, or addicted, that tends to block, sabotage their goals. So that's why it's a problem.
Right. And do you define addiction as going through withdrawal? That's
no, I don't. I define that's a more standard aspect of the definition of addiction. I define addiction as any behavior that you engage in that interferes with, blocks, or sabotages your long-term goals. So if your long-term goal is to live a long, healthy life, and you're smoking like a chimney, then that's an addiction. But if your goal is to enjoy smoking until you die, whether you die of lung cancer or a short life or not, but smoking, the enjoyment of smoking is number one on your priority list, then it's not an addiction.
Well, yeah, but how do you know what people's goals are, right? I mean, in economics, there's this thing called demonstrated preference. You know what people prefer based on their actions. So certain people have a high time horizon. Some people think long term and short term based on the time preference that they have. And so, a person who, like I remember, I've never smoked a cigarette. I have no interest in doing that. In fact, my rule when it comes to taking drugs is I will never take a drug that the people who take it regret taking. And every person I know who smokes wishes they could quit. And so I was speaking to someone who says they wish they can quit, and they were smoking. And, I didn't say this to him because I didn't want to appear rude, but based on his behavior, he doesn't really wish he could quit. Nothing is stopping him from quitting. Plenty of people quit smoking. Rather, he prefers the short-term benefit of whatever it is nicotine gives him over whatever the long-term consequences of stopping that habit may be. And who am I to tell him that is wrong? And he might say he wants to quit, but maybe he's saying it the same way a person says, I want to be a good husband, but he cheats on his spouse, right? I mean, I think we know what people want based on how they act. Talk is cheap.
Yeah. So I agree with demonstrated preference. So wouldn't you agree, Daniel, if someone comes to my office and they say, I'm here because I want to quit smoking, they've demonstrated their preference by getting to my office?
Yes, but if they continue to smoke, I would say that while they may say they want to quit, they don't want to quit. They would rather continue smoking more than they want to quit. Otherwise, they would not continue smoking.
I would agree in the moment. A demonstrated preference is demonstrated preference in the moment. You don't demonstrate your long-term goals by behaviors. You demonstrate your immediate goals. So one of the problems with addictions is that people who are addicted let their short-term thinking trump their long-term thinking, and people who aren't addicted do the opposite. So if someone has an urge for a cigarette and they decide, I'm not going to smoke because I don't want lung cancer, then they've used their long-term goals and preferences to trump their short term, but people who are addicted do the opposite.
Right. So is procrastination then a form of addiction, right? There are certain people out there who say, I hate studying, so I'm just going to procrastinate and not study, and I'm not going to do well on an exam or something, right? So are they addicted to not studying, or are they addicted because they just don't?
it's not that procrastination is a form of addiction, or you could put it that way, but I would say more comprehensively, addiction is a form. Oh, I made a mistake, Daniel. Actually, I agree with you. Procrastination is a form of addiction. And as you said, you're addicted to the immediate comfort. So you get immediate comfort by smoking, and you procrastinating on not smoking. So in that sense, the addiction comes from procrastination.
Right. Right. Okay. So how do you, and maybe there's no connection and no tie-in, but knowing this insight, how do you think that, helps with understanding, people's thoughts concerning the state?
Well, some people are addicted to the state
Yeah.
because for various reasons, because they have a need for approval, and they think that if they spoke about abolishing the state and anarchism, they'd be ostracized from their group and disapproved of. So they have a fear of that. Also, people have low frustration tolerance. In other words, it's frustrating or uncomfortable to study history and study economics and see what exactly is behind the government and what's going on. So they procrastinate on that and put that off. It's easier for them to just believe whatever they're told. So that's another way that might come into it. But there are people who don't have addictions, very intelligent people who think it through, and they just reach, according to us, wrong conclusions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there are also many different views. Like many anarchists, and maybe I'm not being fair, it seems, have this view that people are brainwashed into believing in government, and that there's these people called government who sort of convince people that to get their support. But I think, and maybe I'm just a cynic, I think most people, I think, are cowards, and I think there is an appealing aspect of doing things behind a curtain, right? It's sort of like the philosophical ring of Gyges story. You wear this invisible ring and you do evil because no one knows who you are. I think the appealing aspect to the state to people isn't just that they're brainwashed and it's just blind subservience. I think that there is something perverse in people where they like imposing their preferences onto other people, but they don't have the balls to do it to their face, so they like doing it behind an iron curtain or having someone else do it for them. So
yeah, I agree. I think that's a factor. Also, as Walter Block points out, another factor is our genetic predispositions. He points out how people are genetically predisposed to want to have a leader and want to have a government and those kinds of things, and to think uneconomically about things.
Right.
So that's another aspect.
Yeah, but I disagree with that, because there's an excellent book. Well, it's a mixed book, but it's an excellent book called Fair Play by Steve Landsberg, and it basically is about him talking about how he learned economics from his daughter, and he basically explains how children have economic intuition, and they're sort of weeded out by going to bad government schools. That sort of distorts that people have pretty good economic intuition, but they go to government schools that crushes that. And the way you know that is by looking at children and talking to them before they have a chance to be propagandized and destroyed. So I think, as I mean, as a kid, right? I mean, how many kids naturally just want to follow whatever their parents say? I mean, most kids fight with their parents relentlessly, and their parents sort of just break their spirit and sort of till they give in. So I don't know if I necessarily agree. I think everyone's sort of born an anarchist, and they just get crushed by people who sort of. I think there are two types of people primarily: people who are born anarchists and don't let other people crush their spirit, and other people who are born anarchists and let people crush their spirit, and they give in to the peer pressure. So I think I sort of disagree with Walter Block that people have a natural disposition to a leader. I think people hate being told what to do, but they just end up accepting it once they feel that fighting it is futile.
Yeah. Well, I think you raised good points, Daniel, but where I disagree with you is I don't think it's either or. I think all these things play an influence. And to demonstrate that, using your example of kids who rebel against their parents parents tell them to go to bed at 9 and they stay up till 12, or parents tell them to brush their teeth and they do what they can to get out of there brushing their teeth. So certainly they do rebel against authority, but in some ways they go along with their parents and adopt their parents' views and things like that. So I think we have the biological tendency to believe in socialism and also to believe in capitalism. They're both within people.
Right. I mean, I certainly agree with, Hayek's piece, The Atavism of Social Justice, and I think there is a tendency to not people take for this is why I sort of fundamentally disagree with Jeffrey Tucker, because Jeffrey Tucker's main argument for anarchism is that the best way to have anarchism is to invent new technologies which basically make the state obsolete. But that fundamentally ignores the fact that statism is an ideology, and new technology is not sufficient to fundamentally transform people's ideology. When new technology exists, people just take it for granted, right? I mean, it's like when people say we're the 99%. Bullshit. At least if you live in the United States, the poorest person in the United States, simply by virtue of living in the United States, is part of the 1% if you count it globally. People just take for granted these things, and they act like spoiled brats who just don't appreciate all the fact that these things that we have now are rare, has not existed through most of human history, and are only a result of a few geniuses discovering things that didn't exist, that they decided to create, and that this is not just the natural progression, and that actually wealth is a very vulnerable thing, and is very easily destroyed, and is more easily destroyed than it is to be built. And that's why government policy is so destructive when it ignores the rules of economics. So I think that people, I guess I do agree with you and Walter in the sense that people take for granted whenever the market does something well, right? I mean, people judge the market based on, I don't know, but people judge politicians based on what they say, right? Like when someone watches a commercial saying, this product is the best product, buy this hamburger and women would want to fuck you or something. No one believes that. But when a politician says, vote for me and I'll improve, people swallow it up. So people, I think, are much more easily taken in by politicians than they are by businessmen, which is one of the reasons I support a free market. I think I think that's actually a good thing. And I think one of the reasons that a free market tends not to screw people as much as politics is because people are way more skeptical of the market, and therefore are way more cautious, and are not willing to just take for granted the good things it does, where they're not willing to watch government. They just believe it's a representative agent of the people, and therefore they're more willing to allow it to be abusive.
Exactly. I agree with that. It's sort of like professional licensing, which we were discussing earlier. If someone's a politician, it's as if they have a professional license to tell you what's true.
Right. Yes. What do they say? The politics is the art of making promises you can't keep. Right. Right. And that's right. And all the time people fall for the same crap. I mean, there's an excellent book by James Bovard called ADD Democracy, which is pretty much about how is it that politicians act the same over and over again, and people fall for the same stuff over and over. This just happened. How do you not remember it? Right? I mean, people seem to have very short attention spans, or very short memories, I should say, that they fall for the same crap year after year. There's an excellent cartoon where it's a very small car stuck between two walls that can't get out, and it says Democrat, Republican. It says, let's try reverse again. You vote Democrat one time, you vote Republican next time. When has it ever improved anything? And people still fall for the same stuff over and over again. As this time it's going to be different. Trump's going to change things. Sanders is going to change things. And my response is, don't be an idiot. Why are you taken in by these liars?
Well, I love your passion, Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. So are you optimistic about the future?
I am, but partially because I'm an optimist, and secondly because I think that
which is not based on your experience.
What?
Which is not based on your experience.
Well, it depends on what you mean By the future of what? I'm not terribly optimistic about the future of politics in the short run, more in the long run, as Murray Rothbard said, because it seems to me as people get more and more education, they very slowly begin to get closer to reality in terms of psychologically, politically, everything else. And as we know, the reality is you can run your own life better than the government can. So I think people are slowly seeing more and more that that the state is a lie. So
I don't know if that's, sorry to interrupt for a sec. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt for a sec, but I don't know if I believe that, right? So there were, you know, in New York, and they probably have it in other states, you have to put the calories when you order food, you know, in like fast food restaurants.
do what?
When you, in fast food joints, you have to put the number of calories behind each item,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Well, they did studies and they found that consumption of these products went up. So people were educated. People were educated about how fattening these things are, and it didn't alter in any way the decrease
Right.
in buying these products. So I actually don't think that education is the key, because people either forget it or they just don't care, right? Like people who smoke cigarettes or people who know it's bad for you. Like there's no one who smokes cigarettes who's like, I don't know nicotine causes lung cancer. They just don't care. They just ignore what they know. So I don't think it's solely education, because people just pretend that they don't know it or they don't care that they know it.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, I don't have any more time right now, and we've actually gone over an hour.
You're right.
So it's been a great pleasure speaking with you. And
Likewise.
I appreciate you having me on. And I'd just like to say, if anyone would like to get in touch with me to discuss my ideas further, you can go to my website, which is 3minutetherapy.com. 3 is spelled out. 3-minute therapy is all one word. And 3-minute therapy is my form of therapy, which is based on the work of Albert Ellis. And I'll be happy to speak with you or email you. So thanks again, Daniel.
No problem. Thanks for coming on. I'd love to invite you again. That was fun.
Good.
Take care.
Daniel, do you have a minute?
Yes. Do you want me to turn this off though first?
Yes.
Or
Yes. Yes.
sure. Take care. Bye.